Tim Goldstein, autistic adult, and your host for Life in a Neurotypical Universe, where we take a look at life from the perspective of an autistic adult. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Life in the Neurotypical Universe. Today, we have Emma Pinnock from the UK. And Emma is an autism specialist and consultant who also works in the diversity space. Emma, tell us a little bit about you and what you've done.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma. I'm an autism specialist, as you've heard, and I've worked in the education system, really. So I'm really a teacher at heart. That's where it comes in. I'm also a psychologist, where the two meet in the middle. I've had I wouldn't say a long career in education, which has really developed my understanding of neurodiversity and how the education system needs to respond to that. So my business now is that I go into schools, organisations, and I support families with neurodiversity from a very bespoke and individual point of view. So yes, that's what I do now.
Well, wonderful. So you're taking, experience that you had built particularly in the school arena, and now you're starting to apply it to a broader audience, including the workplace arena.
Definitely.
Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing. You bring a very unique perspective there, because in general, we have lots of people that work with the kids and do phenomenal, great jobs. And we have, a smaller number, but some, amazing people working in the workforce, trying to, create opportunities for these kiddos when they're of the age that they're ready to start working. So what do you see between them? Because, we have a lot of parents of autistic children who don't know what the future looks like, but you've now experienced a little bit of both. I'd love to hear, how you'd compare the two.
Very, very true. I think in terms, if I take it from just like a system point of view first, I think for me, it's about everyone making space and being clear, have to think through difference. No matter how that difference comes into your organisation and school, you have to think it through. And I think that's not been something that people have effectively done in the past. And so it's getting those conversations going, your amazing podcast I've been listening to the weeks beforehand, and having those kind of conversations where people can say, actually, how have I personally made space for somebody who's me? And I think that's where the system has to really start to think and then trickle down to the individual. I think for parents, that's a very broad question, because obviously every child will have their own personal journey and will have their own personal experience of being neurodiverse. However, I think it's understanding that the conversations are happening, and that a lot of parents, unfortunately, in the UK right now, have had some really difficult experiences with the system, and there are a number of reasons why that's happened, in terms of training gaps, in terms of funding issues, in terms of differences between the education system and health system. And so parents have had a very big, some negative experiences at this end of the system. And a lot of them say, can't wait until they leave school and they're out of that. And then it's kind of the question then of, but what happens? But I think there's still a lot of work to do in the UK to make real space and be really clear and reflective about neurodiversity in the workplace. And I think those that have managed to develop social skills and develop skills that can help them along have done quite well and can kind of get into jobs. Maintaining maybe another conversation, but can get into jobs.
Maintaining is definitely a whole nother conversation.
And I think it's a very big conversation, I think, for the UK at the moment, about how, one, do we ensure that the education system is preparing everybody, that's the person with neurodiversity and their peers, to make space for each other as they're growing up and going into society. I think the education system has a bit of work to do there. But then the workspace and the leadership space of the UK has a bit of work to do there too. Really, from a leadership point of view, what do we want for our organisation and how do we make space for everybody? And then actually making sure every employee has that kind of understanding too.
You bring up a really good point when you're kind of comparing the corporate world, the employment world, to the school world. And to me, the point that is interesting about what you mentioned was in the schools, and again, it varies. Some are doing better, some are doing worse, but they're all doing a lot better than they did 10 years ago, which is better than they did 20 years ago. So we're definitely seeing improvement.
Yeah.
And as you say, we catch them there, and at that point now, it's known that they're autistic kids. The kids that are going to school with them know that they're autistic kids, and they learn to get along just perfectly fine. They find out that an autistic kid is just like any other kid. They all have personalities. They're all different. Um,
Exactly.
Unfortunately, I think what we're seeing, and you're definitely pointing to, is we don't have that similar kind of what would you say, space is a good way to put it, in the corporate world where you can walk into most corporations, openly declare that you're autistic, and expect people, other than maybe the ones under 30 that have already gone through schooling where they went to school with other autistic children, you really just walk in. If you say, hey, I'm autistic, the response from most corporations is, that's nice. There's absolutely no how would you put it? There's no safety, there's no space for them to be who they are and just teach them the skills they need to interact. It's more you have to go in and pretend as if you are a neurotypical.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, very, very much that I think that's a big difference that a lot of people aren't really talking about is when you look at the school model. And again, we all agree it's not perfect. We agree that parents have to fight like crazy. Pick your country; it doesn't matter. I deal mostly with the English-speaking countries because it's the only language I speak. Shame on me, but nonetheless, I mean, worldwide. I mean, Australia, the UK, Canada, the US. It's the same thing. Parents have to fight for it, but at least there's something there to fight for, and they know kind of the routine to follow. There's people that have gone down the track. In the corporate world, the big issue is parents don't even know what to fight for or how to go about it or how to teach their now adult autistic child how to interact with that because there's no school in it. You can't send somebody to school for, a month to learn being a corporate person. You get them a job and in a month they're fired. And that was it. That was their experience of building being a corporate person. Not positive.
So true. And I think there's that link, isn't there? It's making some kind of link between the skills that young people develop about getting together and getting along together and understanding that skilling and putting that into a corporate space. And I think it's about training people who are leaders in the corporate space to truly understand neurodiversity and understand its the varying levels of neurodiversity and how that might impact an individual very differently to another individual. But having that sense of and that knowledge is the starting point, I think. And I think because, as you rightly said before, 20 years ago, nobody was thinking about this. I can think about some people that I went to school with now and think, oh, okay. Now that I understand neurodiversity, I'm like, oh, okay, I can see what might have been going on there. And but nobody was thinking in this way. So the children that grew up then didn't have that experience of making space together with somebody who is neurodiverse. So we got hopefully a good 10 years in advance in the future. We should be seeing some really good collaborative work in the workplace because it's now starting to happen in the schools. But I think it's that. What do we do in the meantime to bridge that gap? And ensure that knowledge is strong enough in corporations and organizations that it doesn't just stay at the top or in a small pocket, but it trickles all the way through and everybody's starting to get the gist of what it means to work alongside and be a part of a community with somebody who has difference. And I think it's just really interesting, obviously, as a Black woman in the UK, it's understanding that as well, that actually I know that from that point of view. I know that from the point of view of being a Black person, what being a Black woman in the UK, and understanding how people have had moments of not understanding how to make space for me, you know, And I don't think I pose that much problems, really.
I have to say, I've known you now. We're going over a year that we've known each other, and you're no different than talking to any other brilliant, intelligent human being. One thing that's interesting that you bring up is obviously you have that experience of being a black woman in a country that's primarily not black, not of color of any type, and. What you experience, of course, is people can visually see that you're different. I mean, it's quite obvious. That you're female is quite obvious. That you're of color is quite obvious. So they come to you with a expectation in mind. Now, whether the expectation is correct or not, we could have a long discussion on that, and I think not is likely to win. But nonetheless, they have an expectation based on the visual of assessing who you are.
Very true.
One of the things I've seen in autism, and it'd be interesting to get your feedback both from the school side of it and what you may have seen in the corporate world is, I write about the concept of the uncanny valley of autism, which comes from robotics, and it means really the closer you get to having something being fully human, the more that we tend to relate to it. You take a Roomba vacuum, right? It's kind of like not very exciting. It's a piece of hardware on the floor, it cleans your floor for you. But if we were to go and paste some funny little eyes on it and hang a tail off of it or something, now we have to start getting cute. We'd probably give it a name, And, we would work all our way through till, it becomes more and more human. And what they have found, and it was Japanese researchers that named it, is you get to the point where you're virtually human, but there's something obvious that it's not. Mm-hmm. Suddenly people react negatively. So their interest increases as they think it's human till they suddenly find out, oh my gosh, it's not what I think. Okay. And then they react very negatively because there's something obviously wrong with, it's so close, but there's something wrong that it just makes you not comfortable. Yeah. And I've seen that happen myself because, I can be I can fake a neurotypical pretty well for short periods of time, And what happens, though, and when I say short periods of time, it may be, and this goes back to that employment issue we were talking about initially of it's not getting the job necessarily, although that is a challenge for some. Yes. It's retaining the job you got that is really the biggest challenge. And to me, a lot of it is this, uncanny valley of autism of you go in, they hire you not knowing you're autistic because you do have good enough communication and social skills. And, let's admit it, an interview is a pretty staged kind of thing. Yeah. You can train to do an interview that you may not be able to handle the interactions in a broader audience. But an interview is focused on doing one thing and one thing only, finding a candidate. That's all it's focused on. So it's really, it's easy to fake. So it's easy to get the job if you want to try hard enough. Yeah. But when suddenly that autistic thing comes out, and the autistic thing may be something as simple as a comment that, is not considering somebody's emotions and how they'll react to it. 100% true, Yeah. But it just comes out in the middle of the meeting of, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life. And it's the CEO that's giving the idea. Yeah. Well, it is still the stupidest idea, and it doesn't matter that he's the CEO, and somebody has to tell the king that the king is on the horse with no pants on. Yeah. But unfortunately, in the way it works in the modern world is you're not given a bonus and said, thank you, join the royal court for watching out for the king. You're told, there's the door, don't ever come back. Definitely. What have you seen as far as that kind of, that uncanny valley, that being able to appear in a range of situations as being neurotypical, but certainly having some, manifestations that will appear from time to time that are pretty obvious that you're not the average person.
Yeah, I think, that is such an amazing description and example of what actually happens in schools, in society, because I see a lot of the time, so training takes people only so far. So, I will train a set of teachers, they'll get it, they'll probably get the strategies, they'll feel that, but then there'll be that one moment when the young person without a filter says that thing that makes that teacher go, oh, what? And that human reaction comes to the surface, and that understanding of actually this is probably just part of who that person is lost in that moment. And I think it's a space where we all have to kind of make space for each other in that particular moment, because the other person hasn't understood deep enough what that lack of filter truly means. And so they're actually just reacting out of their humanness. And this is how I would naturally react if a child said something like that to me. And yeah, and then you've got the other side of that where, okay, that lack of filter, maybe if you're capable of trying to learn from that, try to do so. I've had children say some things to teachers and think, oh, maybe you should have said that. I get where you're getting from, like having too much coffee and your breath smells and all that kind of thing. So you've got that kind of thing. And so there is something that we have, the two sides of the conversation really needs to be strengthened, because in that situation, it'd be easy enough for me as a trainer and consultant to be like, oh my gosh, didn't that teacher get it? I've just said this to them. And then forget their own humanness as well, because all of us are able to be offended. But it's then, how do we get past that moment? How can we just actually, because I've had all sorts said to me about children with autism, and I just think, oh, okay. And it is literally a moment where you've just got to think, oh, okay, this is what they think, this is what they feel, and you've got to kind of let it go. And that's kind of getting to the objective of the situation. And if you can get to the objective of the situation that you're in, so my objective was always to teach and to care. So actually, if you offend me in that dynamic, I have to get past that, because my objective is to teach and to care. And so it's understanding what the objective of that dynamic is once you understand the dynamic that you're working within. And I think it's still about getting people to understand the dynamic that they're working within to get to the understanding of the objectives they're working towards. So in your example, when you talked about, the king may not be, wearing anything that is suitable and that he could be spoken to, a person that has the knowledge behind it to say, okay, this person may not have the filter that they have, but actually, is there truth in what they're saying? Because actually that gets to the objective and it might actually improve the organization, is the place that we need to get to, so that we kind of move that little bit of humanness, and it is humanness, out of the way, and we get to the objective of what's been happening. So if someone tells me that situation or that idea is absolutely not going to work, but I think because I'm the CEO, it should, am I doing myself a service, or disservice, should I say, by ignoring that person and getting rid of them? Who knows? But I suppose it's all about making that space work for everybody that's in it.
Where I've seen, I guess I would say the biggest challenge there is, you go and you teach somebody, awareness of autism and how autistic people can be. I mean, the entire range, the entire neural cloud. I mean, they can come from anywhere from, people like myself that, most people assume is neurotypical in most cases. Yeah. Through people that, we would quickly identify as being autistic, without having interacted with them for more than 4 or 5 minutes. Yeah. And what I think ends up happening is we're trying to explain to other people what it's like to be autistic. Mm-hmm. And we fall into really the same trap of you trying to explain to me what it's like to be a Black woman. I mean, you can explain all kinds of situations, but I just can't really 100% relate because I'm a white male. Yeah. And, for whatever stupid reasons, I get these extra privileges because I'm a white male. I didn't ask for them. I just, I was a baby, I was dropped, and it happened to be a white male baby, I mean, it's what I got. But nonetheless, my experience as a white male is certainly very different than your experience as a Black female. And while we can talk about them and, list them down in ways that, people could read it and go, oh, well, geez, that's very interesting how, Emma had to deal with this kind of thing. And geez, I never would have had to face that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it's still not the same as experiencing it like you are. Yeah. And I think that's where we fall down in autism is, first off, if we can't even get male to female or of color versus non of color to understand each other when they're all neurotypicals, It's even harder when we're talking about autism, where you're essentially talking about a completely different processing and perceiving process. And that's why I always say you're talking about aliens.
Yeah.
So how can you, as a human,
Mm.
understand a human that thinks in a process and a pattern that does not represent anything you've ever dealt with? It
Yeah.
doesn't represent a color challenge. It doesn't represent a gender challenge. It represents a completely different picture of the world.
Yeah, I completely get that. And I think sometimes when I think about, and I have thought about it in that way before, never explained it as beautifully as that, but I've thought about it in that way before. And I do think there's times where it's just back to humanness. let's just forget labels and forget that and just see humanness. And we've got these very clear definitions where people are supposed to act or behave or think or experience. And actually, I don't think and behave or act or have the same experience as the other Black woman that stands next to me. So actually, that alone is different. So there'll be things that will very much connect, but actually, we're still very individual people. And I think that still needs to be how we see the world around us, is that no matter how I'm supposed to see you or the misconceptions I'm going to come into this conversation with, I have to put those aside, because actually you're just an individual and you're going to show me your brilliance, your challenge, or whatever you are, but you are just an individual. And I think that's where this gets so hard. And I think because we're focused in as well on a very labor, i.e. workforce driven culture, we're always looking for this skill in the person. We're always looking for a person to be successful or skillful or something like that, instead of just seeing people. And I remember I was having a conversation a couple of months back, and he said, try to, when people ask about you, not tell them what your job is, and see how much of you can explain. And
I love when you say that. And the reason I love that, I just have to, I've got to say this just because it's been one of my things forever. I've told my wife for probably almost as long as we've been married, which will be 35 years towards the end of this month,
lovely.
which is a whole nother story in autism and being married. But um,
Yeah.
I've told my wife that, when I finally pass, do not put down that Tim was and anything that's a profession, or I will haunt you forever. Because I'm not a computer programmer. I'm not a machine shop owner. I'm a human being.
Yeah. 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 And I think that is it. And I think that we forget how to describe ourselves through our humanness, because that's not what we're taught to do.
Right, exactly. We're supposed to almost downplay who and what we are, and instead we're supposed to substitute something that's socially acceptable. So, you substitute, oh, I'm an autism specialist and consultant.
Yeah.
And everybody goes, oh, that sounds really nice. But it doesn't tell us who Emma is.
Not at all.
It just tells us Emma does this for making a living.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that we have to, as a society, we're very driven by that. But then when we see people with difference or with challenge, that's kind of the reverse of what we've been conditioned to try and see, because we've been conditioned to try and see the success in everybody, and how are they somebody that could benefit my organization or benefit our school or benefit the outcomes. And it's actually, how is it that for me as a teacher can I benefit your life? Me as an employer, how can I benefit your life, instead of just the other way around? Now, obviously, that's the idealistic person in me talking. And so I understand the real world. But if there is a actual good balance between, okay, these are the corporate outcomes that we really need to have, but actually we need to have a social conscience while we're doing it, and understand that people that are coming into our organizations come in with all sorts of happenings, and life happens with everybody. And so when we think about all the policies that get the worst, get the hardest pullback on, it's things like flexible working and maternity leave and things like that, because all of these differences that happen throughout life actually impact on productivity. And that's the issue that people aren't seeing past.
Very much. It's very well put. I think it really comes down to when you explain it to somebody, their picture of the difference is nowhere near as great as the difference really is. They don't really understand how far, or what do I say, in how different a methodology
Mm.
and what pieces actually get into our brains. And because they don't understand that, they don't understand the value that we can bring. Maybe saying that rude, what sounded like to the person in the conference room, a rude thing to the CEO,
Yeah.
because what do they say? Everybody else in the room said, well, if I were going to say that to the CEO, I'd only do it under these circumstances, which would be, I'd be, totally, totally upset, probably turned in my resignation and on the way out the door.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, they make the value judgment based upon if I was the person saying that, this is what essentially they're trying to intuit your overall reasoning for why you did something.
Yeah.
And based on their own logic, though,
Yeah.
which will never get to why you did it because they're not you. You did it for a completely different reason than they may have done it.
So true.
And
Yeah.
I think that breaks it down because when that little autism thing slips through, and it may be not quite as bad as insulting the CEO. Maybe you're only insulting the TO or CIO, a little bit lower down in the scale.
Yeah.
The big problem is they don't look at it as being, okay, we know Tim is different. He looks at things a little different. But that also means when he suggests ideas, they're from a completely different perspective. And maybe we should at least consider that perspective. I used to work with a woman who, at the time she was working for Chase Bank, was one of the highest female executives at Chase Bank. And she explained to me about one of her bosses. And to me, this is wonderful. This is if people could implement this, a great idea. And what this gentleman would do is he'd bring his team together of, 10 people or so. I mean, it was a very high executive that she was working for at the time. And he would pose whatever the issue he was dealing with at the moment to the team.
Yeah.
And he'd just go right around and have everybody, give their comment on what they think about the issue. And almost inevitably, he'd get around the whole group and then he'd go do whatever he wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And eventually, the woman I worked for, finally, after long enough, asked him, why do you do that? Because you never do what we suggest. And he says, very simply, I'm just trying to find out, is there something I didn't think about? If I've already thought about it, I already know the answer.
Yeah.
And if all you're suggesting is things I've thought about, then, I'm not going to follow your suggestion. I already thought about it.
Yeah.
But it's that unique perspective of Tim walking in who thinks different that will throw that thing out there of going, didn't see that perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's not looked at that way. It's looked at as being insulting the, higher ups' judgment.
Yes. Yeah. And there's such a journey, isn't there, of that making space in each individual to say, actually, I haven't got all the answers. Because as individuals, we're just all egotistical, aren't we? Like, we all have it about us.
Of course, my answers are always 100% right, no matter who I'm talking to.
Exactly. So, we all can kind of relate to that side of us because it's one of our safety mechanisms as humans as well. We need to kind of feel that we're right, to take the risk that we're right. And so it's something that we have to challenge in ourselves. And I think that's what makes good leaders. I think the best leaders I've ever worked with always challenge their own perspective. And I think that's really, really key. And I think to work with anybody of difference, you have to challenge your own perspective and challenge what it is that you've come to the table with and say, actually, is it the best version? And then that boss, which I think I might adopt now, actually had an amazing way of doing that, in the sense of, I've sat here and I've really gone through the scenarios that I can think of. However, I've now employed a team. And if I can't take on the point of view of my team, what have I employed them for? And I think real leaders know that there's power in allowing your team to lead above you, and sometimes take that space. And so it's really, really key. There's something about confidence. It's something about understanding true leadership and where true leadership comes from. And I think you can only really do that through a very secure base of your own. And when we accept difference, we accept it from a very secure base of our own. And that's very much a bit of a journey for everybody to be on, I think.
You know, and I think that covers any type of diversity that we want to talk about. It's the exact same foundational issue
Definitely.
of we don't accept the other person as being the same as us.
Yeah.
Or even worse, maybe we do accept them as being the same as us when we should accept them as having some differences.
Very true.
You know, that sometimes is appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, somebody from a totally different culture. You know,
Yeah.
obviously you want to try and not, you know, violate any of their cultural norms, but it could be very different from your cultural norms.
Definitely, most definitely. And that's what I mean. I think it's understanding that secure base. Because I think because I don't know what the psychology is behind it, but I'm sure that people kind of question that. Well, if I take that on, what does that say about my truth? You know, if I take that on, what does that say about my understanding of the world? But actually, it's not about taking on, really. It's just about saying, you know, seeing it, saying, that looks really lovely. It doesn't suit me, but actually, I know that that fits that other person and it's perfectly fine. You know?
Exactly right. And nobody's saying they have to take it on. The whole question, the whole concept is, though, at least consider what these people, I mean, if you went out and hired for diversity,
Mm-hmm.
which we know is a big thing companies are doing.
Yes.
I mean, neurodiversity, they're growing into that, but, you know, the general, more categorical, you know, diversities, companies have been working at this for decades now.
Yeah.
And the problem is almost always what you just described of they go and they hire all these different, you know, candidates from all different backgrounds, which bring a complete diverse point of view. But then they never tap the diverse point of view. They just want to have their point of view agreed to.
Yeah, exactly.
So why did you go through all this trouble to hire all these diverse candidates if you're just going to tell them to act just like the ones I had anyways?
Yeah, definitely. I met with somebody today who runs a company looking at diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And he was just so interesting to speak to. So we spoke base because he looks at race and disability at the moment and gender and stuff, and he wasn't really sure on the neurodiversity side. So we were having a conversation about it. And he really made me think, because he said what these schemes that you've talked about do is bring in people from diverse backgrounds, put the numbers up and make sure there's numbers. But what they don't know how to do is retain people with difference, because they're only bringing them in on arbitrary information and for arbitrary reasons. And so people are coming into the organization, but they leave the organization before they can impact near the top. So it impacts the organization's ability to maintain and cost them the earth as well, because people are constantly moving.
Right.
So it impacts the organization's ability to retain difference all the way through their company. It means they can constantly lose the voice of difference in their company because they can't retain that. But then the knock-on effect of that is that the people that leave the company at a certain point because the space wasn't truly made find it very difficult to have good social mobility, because they're constantly having to come out at a certain level from organizations that are not truly making space for them. And when I heard that, I thought that is so, so true. So when we think about the ceilings that have been happening, so, you know, there's a glass ceiling for women, you know, if you talk to people from different races, they'll say the same. That's basically people getting to the glass ceiling of somewhere and just saying, well, actually, there's no more space for me now. They haven't made any space further up, or they actually haven't really allowed the space that they did make comfortable enough for me. And so actually I leave the company at this level, go back into another company at that level, may be able to shift up a little bit more, but actually come back up to that same problem. And so it's that conversation, isn't it, is that it costs business and earth to employ. We know that, you know, to go through the recruitment, to do all of those things. So why aren't they trying, like the business world tries to do? If you get a client and a customer, you keep them because they're actually cheaper to keep than to kind of find more. Why are people not making space in corporate spaces to keep the people that they have actually attracted in the first place? And it's about knowledge, but it's also about that humanness of truly just saying, well, actually, I'm probably just not right all the time. And that person's approach needs to be thought about. Because actually we both have that space that we have to kind of keep moving around in. Now, I do think in some sense race and neurodiversity are very different there, because in race you have to think about yourself and how you present yourself and all those kind of things. Doesn't mean that you should change everything about yourself, but you do have to present and see how you're presenting as well. But that's very, very different in neurodiversity. You are who you are. You're very-
I would actually say it's actually the same in neurodiversity, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Now, there are some people, of course, who fall into the whole neuro cloud where they do need, huge amounts of support. They're nonverbal. They can't dress themselves.
Yes.
Different story. But we're talking about people who, for the most part, are potentially employable candidates so that they can communicate on a,
Most definitely.
I don't know what I don't know what they consider the average reading level. I mean, the general suggestion when you're writing is write for 6th grade. I mean, so they can communicate at least at a level of, of normal.
Yeah.
What I see happening so often though is companies have this need for diversity because of all the social reasons. There's all kinds of reasons pushing it.
Yeah.
And they decide that they need to do that. And of course, the benefits are getting diversity of thought and that kind of thing, which to me is the same thing as high neurodiversity. I think you can actually take virtually any diversity and look at it like neurodiversity, and it works perfectly.
Yeah.
Because what are we really talking about? What's different about you as being a black female than about me as being a white male? It's how I perceive and process the world and the experiences I've had through it. Right? I mean, in other words, it's how I think.
That's so true. Yeah. That's very.
So, I mean, we could really look at it. It doesn't matter. Pick any minority group you want, and we could look at it as the difference is they think differently. That's really the only difference.
That is so true.
And then they display, obviously, what, based on how they think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting.
I think that one of the big problems is companies, on one hand, want to do the diversity because there's market reasons driving it. Certainly as this younger generation is coming along, as we talked about, that it's familiar with all these things. They grew up in a much more integrated environment. They expected the workplace to be like that too.
Definitely.
So you've got pressures from the millennials on down saying, no, that's like not how we treat people like that. It's like, that's John. He's my friend. I went to school with him. Autistic, so what? He's still my friend.
Yeah.
And but what happens though is they want to do that because there's all these great reasons and it looks good, to the shareholders and all that stuff.
Yes.
But they still want to continue being an organization that hires for fit. Which hire for fit, as far as I'm concerned, simply means that essentially we're going to think identically so that we never have a clash with each other because we fit so well.
Very true.
In other words, it's a total opposite of what they're going to do for these other programs. And I think you're seeing a lot of that hire for fit, which has been a thing that's gone on for decades now, as being the direction, big companies have been pushed, is hire for fit.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we're now saying don't hire for fit because all you end up with is a bunch of robots that think the same way. Hire for diversity so you get a variety of opinions. And now we have companies that are stuck in the middle. They don't know what to do.
That's so true. That's so true. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's certain jobs that just have a particular skill base and that is it. But I think, you can hire for creativity and you can hire for innovation. And if you are thinking along those lines, you will choose people who are not your norm for your organization, whatever that norm is. Because if you are trying to be creative and be innovative, that word, then you will choose people that look exactly like your offices, or you would already be the creative, innovative version of yourself. And so it's really getting people to think differently about themselves, the workplace. And I was talking to the same guy actually that runs the diversity, and he was talking about how school no longer is fit for purpose. And as a teacher, I clutch my heart a little bit, but it's true. It's very true that actually education possibly isn't going to be fit for purpose going forward. I think primary education definitely, because it sets the foundations of reading, writing, mathematics, all of the foundations that we need. But I think the secondary system is going to have a bit of a radical change around what are we asking the young people to be, in inverted commas, for the world that's coming up, because the young people now, as you rightly said, the millennials, are very much more about creativity and creative, standing on their own 2 feet, doing it in their own way, using the internet. And actually, to do that, you have to be a very thinking, reflective, responsive person. And I don't necessarily think that the education system is set for that, which is why neurotypical people and other people with difference find the education system very difficult, because they are from a very young age having to be responsive to critical thinking, because there's critical thinking in the environment around their difference. And so they're already responsive to it. And so but the school's not thinking that way. So when that child is actually critically responding to the learning, that's looked at as an issue, instead of actually, what is it that you're actually trying to say to me? There is behavior needs. Let's not take that out of the equation. But there are times when I'm usually the one who receives the child at the end of some kind of incident. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm listening to the child, and from their account only, I can exactly see where they're coming from. Was it okay in the classroom at that point? Probably not. But your point of view, I can see. And I think that's very hard for teachers to do right now, because they're not in a structure and a system that allows that real critical, responsive exchange. So it's really interesting, isn't it, that from education, really, we're squeezing that creative mind, that critical thinking mind, and we're not actually allowing space properly for it. We're kind of artificially giving them space to do it. But actually, a real critical mind is organic to the person, and they will criticize what they perceive and see. There's still a radical change in the way that we allow young people to express the things that we wouldn't naturally want them to express. There's still an issue there, and it's about giving space for that too. Yeah.
If people wanted to reach out to you and engage you for some of the different services and things and such you do, what would be the best way for somebody to reach you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter. My company name is essentialeducationgroup.com. And so you can find me there as well, or just find me on LinkedIn. You can usually see most of my activity on there. Yeah.
Emma and I had such a great time chatting that we decided to just keep on chatting. And while we chatted, we also kept the recorder going. And with that, we were able to come up with 2 phenomenal episodes for life in the neurotypical universe. And out of that, this is the end of session 1, which is why it kind of cut off a little quick. But give us a little bit of time, and we'll be putting up session 2, where we'll pick up where we left off and continue on through to the close. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed. We hope that you've enjoyed another episode of Life in a Neurotypical Universe. Please, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends. Go take their phone and subscribe them. Heck, it will help us all out. If you want to know more about neurodiversity or have any questions for me, you can reach me at my website, timgoldstein.com, where I'll be more than glad to help you as best I can to navigate through the neurotypical universe.